All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of the 31st Annual Demographic Workshop, our first ever online workshop, and the first time it's ever been split over 2 days. So it's an interesting format this year. Last week was just terrific. And my name is Dowell Myers. For those who don't know me, I'm one of the organizers of the event, professor at USC. It's been in charge to me to give a recap of some highlights of what we did last week. And I got to say, it was quite daunting to try to boil this all down to just a few minutes of recap. But I've studied over the tapes, the files, and the like to pull out what I think are really some gems. I think I would be remiss if I didn't start by emphasizing the excellent welcome remarks we had at the very beginning by our top leadership. They were very compact and really pithy comments that they're worth hearing again, offered by Jack Knott, the USC Price School Dean, who is now going to be leaving the university to go to NYU, New York City, as the dean there. In July, he leaves. But Jack's been, part of this event for more than a decade. We also had Komi Ijuse, SCAG CEO, who will be continuing next year. We thought it was interesting. We discovered that the Price School Price School of Public Policy at USC that Jack Knott is the dean of was the number 2 ranked policy school in the country, whereas SCAG is the number 1 metropolitan planning organization in the nation. So two powerhouses joining together here to sponsor this event. And we heard from Rex Richardson, who's the incoming SCAG president from Long Beach. And that he gave, I was very, very pleased to hear his remarks. I had not heard him speak like that, and that was, it augurs well for the organization in the coming year. After that, we went to our opening panel with what we call the demographic checkup, because every year the demographics are so different, we got to keep an eye on them. And lately they've been just changing wildly. It was moderated by Janet Goldberg, who's an applied demographer and is chief of research for a financial technology firm, the Learning Club in the Bay Area. And Jana has been affiliated with us previously, having her PhD from USC, and also she moderated the same panel last year to great success. This is a decennial census year, so we wanted to kick off with the Census Bureau last week, and we're going to have another great speaker coming up here shortly, Jamie Christie, this afternoon from the Census Bureau. But we had Armando Mendoza speaking last week. 2020 is a decennial year, and the Bureau's goal is to get a complete count. Armando showed a graph of California's slowing population growth, and also he produced a map of congressional reapportionment that occurred after the 2010 census, just to show how the census numbers, which are constitutionally mandated, are used in apportioning political representation, and how important it is to have every state have an equal chance at full representation in the census and in the House. And toward that end, the Census Bureau is using extensive outreach efforts across the nation to get a complete count. That was followed by Beth Giraz from the Population Reference Bureau. That's a nonprofit organization that does domestic and also international population research, tracking events globally. They do publications based in Washington, D.C., the longstanding, really a mainstay of the demographic world. Beth, who's based here in California, gave a detailed look at the risk of undercount, really honing in on some of the subgroups that are most likely to be missed. She showed a slide that over the last few decades, last couple of decades, the Census Bureau has gotten the undercount down to about 0, really very efficient compared to what it was back in the 1960s and 70s. And they're hoping we can do that again this decade. But this year is more challenging with COVID and other things that are looming and have really slowed down procedures. We're hoping to have Jamie Christie share some of his experience and how to cope with that. Planning a census in the middle of a pandemic is not an ideal way to go. But Jamie is, well, he's upcoming. I won't introduce him now. So certain groups are more at risk of being missed. And Beth detailed the procedures that are being used to help guard against the undercount. Really, she had a lot of information in there, and you should go and look at the SCAG website where the presentations are archived, and that will be available there to see more about what she had to say. And the same with Armando's presentation I just presented, just summarized. And then the third and last speaker in that panel was Walter Schwarm, who's the chief demographer of the California Department of Finance. He's in charge of doing the population projections. And that's been a difficult job with all this volatility going on. So he actually compared his newest projections with earlier ones, which isn't always done, but he showed that there's 5 million fewer residents expected in 2060 than previously thought. The statewide population will be 45.3 million at that time, an increase of only 5.4 million over 40 years. I remember a decade, the 1980s, when we accomplished 6 million growth in one decade. So this is quite a slowdown from back then. It's not to say that the needs aren't growing in the state, because some age groups are surging. Children are falling in particular, but the total is not growing as fast as it once did. So Walter gave us a look under the hood about what's behind these low numbers. He showed the fertility rates, how they're dropping. It's down to only 1.5 babies per woman. 2.1 is replacement rate. So we're in the league with the other European nations now. Japan and Korea are still lower than us, but 1.5 is a lot lower than California's had before. Migration also is declining. Well, deaths are rising from an aging population. And so all these components here are leading to slower overall growth. Walter concluded by saying that he needed a complete and accurate count from the 2020 census to help him make the best projections going forward. So all of us can certainly help Walter get better projections by stimulating the turnout for the 2020 census. And there's other slides he showed fairly detailed. You need to look on his website, on the SCAG website, to see Walter's presentation, and that will give you a good handle on what he presented. And that was just a summary, really. Panel 2 was highly interesting to me, since I was also on that panel as a speaker. But the changing demographics and housing have been a particularly alarming situation, leading to lots of state legislation in the last couple of years. More legislation than any time I can remember, probably since World War II, or I don't know, a long time. But the dire situation, it's also been a barrier, I think, to migration, and part is what's leading to declining migration. It doesn't support our economic growth anymore, which Walter was looking at. But what we looked at, we had Linda Wheaton as our moderator. She's a senior housing policy advisor with SCAG. Previously, she was a high-ranking official with the State Department of Housing and Community Development. So she's got long experience in the housing field, and she kept everybody in her panel on task and gave us questions ahead of time about what we were covering and what we might add, which we were pleased to receive because she kept us in a relevant sphere. First speaker was Gary Painter. He's my colleague in the Price School at USC, but he's also director of the USC Price Center for Social Innovation, and he's director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, which is a collaboration across institutions in Southern California. He spoke primarily on homelessness in Los Angeles, where we had the best data available. He had a fair number of numbers really to share. I can't summarize them all here. I think the discouraging thing is that despite all our efforts, the numbers of homeless are still rising. Although I noticed not rising as fast in LA County as they are in California as a whole. So the local efforts here maybe are helping us relatively compared to the rising problem statewide. In general, in LA County, the chronically homeless were 28%, the newly homeless, 23%. And then another category, the unsheltered, which is not a subset of the others, it's a superset. The unsheltered, those who are not taken care of and any institutional facilities, 75% homeless. So that's a very high number. And about half of, he had some data about motivations or explanations for why people fell into the homelessness category. About half were for economic reasons. Other reasons included health reasons and behavioral issues. And these were both of these were a little bit more common among the chronically homeless than among those who are newly homeless. There's some tough problems to solve there, but all these components have been growing. And Gary asked the question, how did we get here? And he tried to summarize in general what led to this surge. And there was overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. He cited housing segregation and discrimination because African Americans had a particular high incidence of homelessness and thought that was part of the cause, and also employment discrimination and unemployment. All these are factors that are working to raise the homeless numbers. So that was a broad overview, and his slides are available on the website also, and gave a very good summary, I thought, of a broad topic. Our next speaker is Jung Ho Park. He's a postdoctoral researcher at USC, and he put together two topics under one umbrella. His topic was on empty bedrooms and overcrowded rental housing. The empty bedrooms occurred primarily among owner-occupied housing. Empty is defined as more bedrooms than you have people living in the unit. And there was 38% of the homeowners in the SCAG region who had at least 2 empty bedrooms. Now, of course, one of those is filled up with their office, and one might be filled up with their junk. My junk expands to fill all rooms in my apartment, so I know how that works. But there were 2 extra bedrooms, and it's a lot of space. It's very generous space. It's a luxury to have that. And the other extreme was to look at rentals, apartment rentals, and to see what percentage of them were overcrowded. Overcrowded is defined as more than 1 person per room. Rooms include not just the bedrooms, but the living room, dining room, kitchen also. So that's a lot of people packed into an apartment. 15% of the renters in the SCAG region are in overcrowded condition. Jung Ho also put a chart up comparing all the large metros in America from west to east. And the SCAG region, with both LA Orange Metro and the San Bernardino Riverside Metro, stand at the top of the whole nation. We're way above New York. New York's the third largest, the third highest overcrowding rate. We're up at 15% overcrowding. So I think that's a symptom of the housing crisis. And it's another symptom. If you're not homeless, then you're overcrowded. These are part of this, derived from the same underlying root causes of a housing shortage and high prices and other factors like that. I finished up with a overview of the housing crisis in general, and it's hard to summarize all my own stuff. I don't want to go into it all, but there's basically 2 things have collided to create the crisis. One is the surge of demand from the millennials coming up from just aging out of their parents' bedrooms and moving into their own units. And then also the decline in homeownership, which threw all these would-be diverted homeowners into rental competition. And then on the other side, on the supply side, Great Recession put a big damper on construction, and we really haven't responded. We haven't recovered adequately from that downturn. I showed then a couple slides about building permits over time. And recently we've had a big surge in construction since 2010, but the little boomlet since 2010 is tiny compared to what we had in the 2000s or back in the 1980s or 70s. And so you put it all in perspective, and we have pitifully little construction actually going on. I looked at also briefly summarize the report we've done on filtering this spring. Filtering is when as housing gets older and low-income people can get access to more apartments because of aging and obsolescence. And as the other previous renters move out, then very low income renters can gain decent housing at an affordable price. Unfortunately, that used to work, and it's not working anymore in our region. And I showed all the metros in California. And since 2010, it's been working in reverse. The low-income opportunity has been lost out of all these old, aging apartments. They're gentrifying instead, right across the board. It's a very alarming situation. That's available for you on the website as well for you to inspect. So I think I'll complete my my recap right there, because I know that we are on schedule here. And is Jamie Christie available online yet?
Yeah, I'm here, Dal. Good afternoon.
There's Jamie. All right, let me introduce you, Jamie. We are so pleased to have James T. Christie. He's been for a long time been the director of Census Bureau's Los Angeles Regional Office. So he's no stranger to our annual demographic workshop. He's been a sponsor of it for more than 20 years, at least the agency has. But Jamie's been taken away during the decennial census, and now he's the Census Bureau's assistant director for field operations, and that's nationwide. So this directorate employs approximately 11,000 people during non-census years conducting surveys, and will swell to more than 500,000 during the 2020 census. I guess some good news for Jamie must be that, back in January, we had record low unemployment. It was hard to employ good workers, and now we have really high unemployment. So maybe it's gotten easier to him to find workers. I don't know, but we invited him to come and speak about progress with the decennial. Especially interested in how has he been able to cope with decennial operations in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, that's really a difficult task. So, Jamie, I'm going to turn the floor over to you if you'd like to address we have over 500 people here, so careful what you say.
Sure, got it. Well, thank you, Dowell, and always good to join you. And this is a good event, and as you guys have realized already, that you learn a lot of really nice things. So should I sell my house or keep my house, Dowell?
You keep it.
Okay, I'll keep it. So what I want to do is, I've got about 15 minutes here. I just want to kind of give you an update real quickly on where we are with the 2020 census. I assume that most of you are pretty familiar with how we do a census. You probably heard it in a number of different settings, but I want to spend just a quick update in terms of where we are. But I really want to focus on some of the changes we've incorporated as a result of the pandemic. So if you go to the next slide, this is the money slide. This is how America is responding to the census so far for the 2020 census. There's a lot of interesting information, maybe just to me, but you sort of see the pattern on the slide of the geographic rates of response. You can see the map, and I'll show you a slide in a second that gives you the actual state-by-state breakdown. But you can see that how America has responded to the census. As of yesterday, we had 61.5% of addresses that had responded to the census. In California, it was about 1% higher, 62.5%. But the response by mode, if you see it on the left of your screen, over 80% of people responded by internet. That's higher than what we expected. We saw rates in countries like Canada and the UK Australia of around 70%. So we're actually trending higher in terms of internet response. And COVID certainly could have had something to do with that, but that was interesting. We offered a phone response for the first time, and our phone response was only about 1.3 million. But the characteristics of the kind of people that responded by phone are pretty interesting. We're seeing a lot of older Americans that are using the phone as a means to respond. And we continue to find paper as a viable option for significant areas of the country that either don't have broadband service or choose to just respond by paper. I mean, they're just used to paper. It's the kind of people that still read the Sunday paper. So anyway, that's kind of how it's trended, and you can see that that the self-response rate has gradually been rising. We're kind of at the tail end of self-response, but we will continue to keep the opportunity open, our website, our call centers, and the ability to process paper all the way deep into the census cycle, and I'll talk about that in a second. So next slide. This is a slide that you can look at real fast. I think we'll post this if you want to download it. I'm not going to go into much detail here, other than to point out we have variability by state in terms of how they participate. And you'll see this as, you'll see states like New Mexico that have a 50% response rate, and the 2010 response rate was 60%. So there are some states that perform differently, and that is a direct outcome of COVID. And I'll talk about how that is in just a second here. But other states are performing very well. The state of Washington, for example, is already almost at its 2010 rate. And you can see California is trending pretty well. It's at 62.5%, which is higher than what we expected. It's still behind the 2010 rate, but the 2010 rate that's produced there is at the end of the whole census. After everybody's had a chance to respond, how many people responded directly. We still expect to get a number of people that will continue to respond online and send back their form, especially when that census taker knocks on their door and says, hey, can I talk to you? They're gonna say, oh, I'm gonna go online and answer the census. Next slide. So this is where I want to talk about real quickly what we've done to adjust the census. And for context, the census is the largest peacetime activity that's done by the federal government. So making an adjustment to the census is a pretty monumental task. And the timing of the outbreak, Census Day was April 1st. We started to adapt our operations around March 1st and make adjustments. I mean, the timing just couldn't have been worse from our perspective in terms of when it hit and when we had to make adjustments. But obviously we had kind of three priorities. One is to protect the health and safety of the American public and our employees. We needed some expert help. So we followed the guidance of federal, state, and local authorities, but we're still committed to making sure that we get a complete and accurate count of all communities. And this is obviously, as you all have been dealing with, it changes every day. And so we're adapting on an ongoing basis. So I'll go to the next slide. So this is kind of, and I'll kind of go through this in a little bit of detail. How we count the American public is through a series of separate operations. The self-response phase, which I talked about earlier, is your ability to answer the census. So 62.5% of Californians have already completed this. We started the opportunity to answer the census on March the 12th. We made the website available and we started collecting responses. And we were originally going to run that through the end of July 31st. However, with the COVID outbreak, we extended that response period through the end of October. So that's a pretty sizable extension of 3 months that we added into the process. So that's a big change for us. So now you can see the bookends of the census are March 12th to October 31st. That's how the majority of households will respond to us. The next line there, group quarters, there's a lot of people who live in settings that are not residential addresses, people that live in prisons or group homes or nursing homes. Nursing homes is a big challenge for us right now. That operation was initially going to happen between April 2nd and June 5th. We've extended that period now for the responses to go through September 3rd. And we're working already with group quarters. We're having a number of conversations. Particular challenge to us is the colleges and universities, and I'll touch on that in just a second. But that's a challenge for us. We have introduced for the first time on this census the ability for group quarters to respond online. And so they're getting that opportunity, and we're actually seeing much higher rates of completion with the online option than we expected, which is a good thing for us. And I think it's good for them too, because they don't want a census taker walking into their facility. We do have a phase similar to the option of a self-response for group quarters. If they don't self-respond, we will go visit them. And that's that in-person group quarters enumeration, which was originally going to end on June 5th. It also will be extended through September 3rd. We are looking to minimize the amount of people that we send to group homes, particularly nursing homes right now. But there is still a component of our operation where we will have census takers visit group quarters. This next line, update leave stateside and update leave Puerto Rico, I want to just touch on it real quick. So in the vast majority of the country, we deliver a census invitation or a questionnaire by mail. But there's certain parts of the country where we can't get the form to the housing unit. Either there's a lot of post office boxes in that area, or it's not well addressed. And so we do hand delivery of those questionnaires. And while we're out there doing the hand delivery, we update the list of addresses to make sure we haven't missed anything. So we update the address list and we leave a census form. That was the primary means for us to deliver census forms to those areas and for people to self-respond. You'll see that the original time frame was March 15th to April 17th. And you could almost have put on the calendar the peak outbreak or the peak sort of time that the pandemic hit the United States was about those same dates. So we suspended our delivery of census forms. And so in the previous slide where you had seen that some states were delayed in terms of their response, states like New Mexico and Puerto Rico, that's because we did not get the chance to start delivering forms until May 4th. And even then we started doing it on a slow basis. Just today, I think we surpassed 98% of those forms have been delivered, but we're already in June. And we should have had those forms in people's hands by mid-April. So there's clearly been an impact in those rural areas primarily where we hand-delivered forms in their ability to respond to the census. Puerto Rico was unique because of the hurricanes. We were initially going to mail to about 60 to 70% of Puerto Rico. But when the hurricanes hit Puerto Rico, it wiped out a bunch of the housing units. And so we had no confidence that the mail could get to the right addresses. So we switched the methodology to be all hand-delivered questionnaires. So it had a big effect on Puerto Rico. Next slide. Update Enumerate is a really small operation where we just go one time. And while we're out there, we just knock on the door and get the interview. This is primarily northern Maine and southeast Alaska, just a handful of places where we do this, 2,000 households. That timing switched to extend all the way through July 29. So we're on schedule with that one. That's going okay. Non-response follow-up. This is the big one. This is where we will hire close to 500,000 people to go knock on doors and collect the information from households that don't send their form back. So initially we had planned to do this beginning on May 13th through July 31st. And the reason we began this on May 13th, we selected communities that were around colleges and universities to try to get there early so that we could get those off-campus students. We get the on-campus students, the people that live in dorms and college housing through our group quarters program. But you guys know this, a lot of college students live off campus. And so we wanted to focus our non-response follow-up efforts as close as we could before spring break hit or before the end of the school term hit and collect that. Well, the pandemic sort of prevented our ability to do that. So we are now working with a number of organizations to try to get administrative lists of colleges that live in off-campus housing so that we can use that to assess whether we have gotten a good response from those off-campus students. And there's a lot of questions about residency rules for college students. Do they get counted at home? Do they get counted at the school? And every condition is a little different, but in general, students get counted at where they live on April 1st. And for most students, that's at the college where they're attending. That schedule for non-response follow-up has now changed. We will begin knocking on doors on August 11th through the end of October. We're not going to begin knocking on every door on August 11th, and I'll talk through that in just a second, but that's a change. Another big change that we made are the next two operations. Service-based enumeration, Dowell was talking about how the homeless population has changed in California. We do our own count of homeless. Initially, it was going to be scheduled for 3 days, March 30th through April 1st. We've now switched that to September 22nd to 24th. And we've worked with a lot of organizations, federal agencies, local agencies, mayors, and September 22nd to 24th seems to be the best time to reschedule that homeless count. We're actually going to go to the street and count people on the streets on September 24th. That originally would have been April 1st. And then the enumeration of transitory locations is another category of the ways people live. A lot of people in RV parks. This is where we count people that travel with the circus. Circuses are still traveling. We still have to count them. And there's a number of other different situations that way. Next slide. This is a fun one for you. So the Census Bureau has proposed a change in the delivery of our data products. And our realigned plan means that we cannot deliver the census population counts to the president by December 31st for the purposes of apportionment. So we have a new timeline that has us delivering those population counts by April 30th of 2021. And this is still a matter of public policy, and there's discussions about this, but this is our schedule that we've laid out that we can meet based on these changes to the COVID. So internally, there's a lot of operational changes, but externally, these are the big changes that come as a result of the virus. So instead of the apportion counts going to the president by December 31st, we now propose that they go to the president by April 30th. And then the redistricting data, the old SF1, or if you've really been using this a long time, the STF1, that data that will be delivered in a time schedule between probably June, and it will be delivered by July 31st of 2021. So that's the data that states will use for redistricting. So this slide has packed in it a whole bunch of issues and a whole bunch of information. And there's ongoing conversations about this now, but this is the time schedule that the Census Bureau has applied to our operations, and this is what we think we need to be able to deliver these counts. Next slide.
Jamie, we're running short of time.
Oh, sorry.
But you can finish up. That was really a key slide right there. I didn't want to interrupt you there.
Yep. So I'll just, you can skip this slide, and I'll just, you can skip this one. And I'll just say that we've resumed our operations. You can see that we've sort of hopped around the country and we've reactivated operations. We're now active in all 50 states, the district in Puerto Rico, in every office in the country. But that only happened, June 11th was the final activity that we did that. So we have just gotten underway in some areas in the country. So it's been an interesting ride for sure. So I think that's it. Next slide.
So that is excellent. I have a question for you though. Well, maybe I have a correction. You used the phrase adjusted census a couple of times. You mean adjusted schedule.
You know what? That's a really important clarification. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is an adjusted schedule.
So
yes.
It's not adjusting the data. It's
correct.
After the census is long done, we might talk about that, but not. Well, it's it's totally understandable. You've had a COVID. We've all been shut down for 3 months. So, and you can't have people knocking on your door, strangers knocking on your door in this situation. So it makes total sense what you planned out there. Right. But was it right though? It's easier to find workers now because of the economic recession than it was before.
So it's easier to find people interested in working. It's when they look at what they're going to be doing, going out and knocking on doors, that some of them find that they're not interested any longer. But we're actually having no difficulty filling positions.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I know it's in very capable hands. So I'm glad that you're on that job.
Thanks.
I hope you come back here soon, though. All right, thank you, Jamie. That was excellent. Well, let me turn now. I want to introduce, I want to point out our social media feed is on the screen here right now. Those of you who want to post any notes, feel free to include these links here. I want to introduce Sarah Jepson, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker. Sarah is the Director of Planning for the Southern California Association of Governments. Which is the nation's largest metropolitan planning organization, if I did not say that already. Her responsibilities include developing and updating the regional transportation plan, the sustainable community strategy, and also she oversees the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, among other responsibilities. Pretty broad portfolio. But Sarah will now introduce our keynote speaker.
Okay, thank you, Dow. Appreciate your collaboration on this conference and heard many good things about day one. So thanks again for your collaboration in talking about these important issues. I'm really pleased to be here today to introduce Chris Porter, who will provide this year's keynote on big shifts ahead for housing in a post-COVID world. This is a really important topic for SCAG and the work that we do on long-range forecasting, but also critical to the work that we're doing with local governments to shape public policies and programs that will accelerate housing production that advances our collective vision for a more equitable and sustainable region. In particular, I think that the perspective from the private sector is essential in figuring out where and how the public and private sector can work more closely together to address the gaps where the market alone is not serving our communities particularly well. We know that the pandemic and economic collapse have very different impacts across our communities, and that low income and communities of color are the hardest hit. Last week, we heard presentations on homelessness, the extent of the housing undersupply in the region, and how to match housing to people, which all emphasize the importance of equity planning when it comes to housing. But something we often hear from our cities, and as we've done our regional housing needs assessment work, is that as cities, we don't build housing, the private sector does. So we're excited to have Chris here today to discuss the market side of housing in the context of COVID-19. I think that what you're going to hear from and see in Chris's presentation is that there's a tremendous need and opportunity for collaboration between the public and private sector to more holistically serve the needs of our communities. Right now, and thanks to some new state funding available to SCAG, we have the opportunity to substantially expand our housing supportive efforts and are launching an economic recovery strategy work program that's focused on economic inclusion to help support our local jurisdictions as they plan for the post-COVID-19 challenges that lie ahead. With these resources, we hope to explore and identify new and innovative opportunities to collaborate with the private sector to provide additional housing choices and to achieve a more resilient region. So with that, I want to again thank Chris for being here today. Chris is a Senior Vice President and Chief Demographer at John Burns Real Estate Consulting, which provides independent research and consulting related to the housing industry. Chris is part of a highly proficient team of research analysts and consultants and officers across the country who work together to provide a trusted source of housing analysis. In his role as a chief demographer, Chris helps the firm's clients understand the role demographics play in shaping the housing demand. So thanks, Chris, for being here today. And as he's giving his presentation, I do want to remind you all in the audience that we'll have a few minutes after his presentation for a discussion. So please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box. So thanks,
Sarah.
Welcome, Chris.
Appreciate it. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Great. Hopefully you can all see that now. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how the consumer changes as a result of this COVID crisis and how we think that impacts housing. As I dig into that, I want to start with a framework that our CEO came up with as part of a book we wrote several years ago on how to think about demographic shifts. We call this framework the 4-5-6 rule. And here's how it works. We gave the name four big influencers to the four categories that we think influence demographic shifts. You've got government policies, as Sarah was just talking about. You've got economic conditions, you've got technological advancements, and you also have societal shifts as well. And our thought is that as we monitor these different categories of influence, we can process that change through this framework to really see how consumers are impacted and ultimately what that means for demographic shifts. I mean, the fascinating thing about COVID-19 is that it touches on each one of these four influences. You see influencers, you see government policy, economic conditions, technological advancements, and societal shifts all happening as a result of COVID. So here are the four big influencers again, and this is part of our 4-5-6 rule for demographic predictions. We've got the four big influencers, but really what is a very crucial part of this framework is to realize that these influences impact different groups in different ways. So we came up with 5 different stages of life that will be impacted directly. And that's those in childhood, those in their early career years, those in family formation years, those late in their career, and those who are retired. As we think about how those changing influences affect these different groups of people differently, it helps us to come up with the answers to what we think are the 6 key consumer questions. This is you guessed it, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Now, you probably all remember this from elementary school as the 5 W's and an H. These consumer questions ring true for any industry, whether you're selling consumer packaged goods or you're selling homes. So as I think about this for COVID's impact on housing, I hear the key questions that I think we need to be thinking through. Who is going to be living differently as a result of this crisis, and who will they live with? What types of housing and living environments are they going to be demanding? When do they expect to make changes to their housing situation? Where will they choose to live? Why do they choose to do things differently or the same? And how do they make their decisions, and how do they make those decisions happen? So as I mentioned, we talked about how each life stage is impacted differently. And I want to give an example of how I think COVID affects the 5 different life stages. For example, for children, at the moment they're trying online school. Is this going to change education? I don't think they're all going to go online for the rest of their educational career, but maybe partial college online education is going to help save them from some student debt down the road. For those who are early in their career, I mean, this is just terrible timing. We saw this with the great financial crisis for the oldest of the millennials as well. Many are going to be financially impacted, which hurts their chances at home ownership anytime soon. And it's going to make a lot more financially cautious about the future. For those in family formation years, I mean, maybe they're waiting to have kids right now until this pandemic ends. But if they have kids, maybe they are reconsidering where they live. They want to go to the suburbs and get a nice big yard because they found that cramped up in a small house or a small apartment is not working for their family's needs. Those in their late career, maybe they're working longer than they thought they would be because they saw their finances get hit, although the stock market is unexplainably much higher than we thought it might be at this time. And then for those that are getting laid off, we think that some of them are going to say, this is just time for me to retire, and they'll leave the labor force altogether. And then for those who are retired, this is one of the groups, obviously, that's most vulnerable to COVID. Will the health implications of this virus make them rethink where they want to retire and how they retire as well? Are we going to see more multi-generational housing or more aging in place? So that's really our 4-5-6 rule. It's a framework that I hope can be helpful to you as you kind of think about how government policy, the economic conditions, technology, and societal shifts are transformed by COVID. But I want to switch topics a little bit and talk about the consumers and housing specifically. Housing finds itself in this really interesting time right now. Every building or housing industry executive will tell you that job growth and interest rates are what drives their business. On the jobs front, we've seen state unemployment offices receive more than 46 million jobless claims during COVID crisis. And there's another 11 million on top of that who are getting pandemic unemployment assistance that they're not getting from the states because they don't qualify for government unemployment. So 46 million jobless claims filed. On the other hand, today we hit a national average of 3.13% for the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That is the lowest in history. And we've seen some promotions from home builders out there advertising rates that begin with a 2. So this is pretty unbelievable. You have a horrible job market, and you've got great opportunity for people to get in at a very low rate on their mortgage. So some really interesting things going on with housing right now. And with the exception of the home improvement spending that you're seeing everybody doing as they're trapped in their homes and the stockpiling of essential items, consumers really are pulling on their purse strings pretty tight. Consumer spending fell about 7% in March, and we weren't even shut down for all of March. April was twice as bad, about 14% drop in consumer spending. The savings rate jumped to the highest level ever. And you look at these two graphs, I can't tell you how many graphs we're having to change the axis on, because we've never seen this much change in such a short period of time. And these two graphs, they should really be no big surprise. We've seen how people are trying to utilize the assistance that they're getting from the government or the unemployment to really save for another emergency. And I think these spending and saving trends are really important to monitor, especially since housing costs are people's biggest expenses. So how do we think that consumers' behaviors about finances are going to play out in the housing market? In the short term, and this is a term that one of my colleagues, Michaela Sharp, who actually put together a lot of this presentation for one that she had done previously. In the short term, we think there is going to be what we call a post-COVID shuffle. And this is people who are being helped by government stimulus and very low mortgage rates are going to try to get out of a house that they hate and into a new one before a potential next wave of lockdown begins. This would include people who were planning to move and then put it on hold, first-time buyers who were fleeing apartments, people who are upgrading to a home that better fits their needs, but then also people who are collapsing households as well and moving back in with someone else. I mean, you see this happening with college students, but Quicken Loans did a survey and found that 1 in 10 people moved back in with their parents during this pandemic. In the long term, once this starts to settle down, we do think that we're going to enter a period of thrift and caution. Spending is only going to increase as people try to rebuild their savings. The fear of the virus itself and of its economic repercussions will also keep some spending below normal levels. And just as a way to kind of measure that, I found this really interesting graph from Ernst & Young, where they call it the Future Consumer Index or Customer Index. And they're predicting the 5 segments that are going to come out of COVID. They've ordered them based on their anticipated spending behavior going forward, from the more cautious on the left to the less cautious on the right. They estimate that about 15% of people will keep cutting. I mean, this is the group that's less likely to be working. They are making deep spending cuts and changing what they buy and how. The pandemic was what they worried about, and it came true. There's about 20% that are going to stay frugal. They're spending slightly less and making cuts to try to get back on their feet. You've got another 24% who are what we call cautiously extravagant. They're focused on health. They're middle to high income and are relatively optimistic. They will spend if it's something that's important to them. About 26% are what we call a get to normal. They're not concerned about the pandemic at all. Their spending will be largely unchanged. And then you've got another 14% that's back with a bang. They tend to be younger and working. They've been disrupted, but they're optimistic. And they'll be spending much more in all categories, really. So when you look at this in total, about 60% are going to be spending somewhat less, or spending more cautiously, I should say, than before, compared to about 40% who will be getting back to normal. So as we think about the consumer trends and how that impacts housing, I think there's 2 things that's really important to remember. And the first is that large events do not really create new trends. They only accelerate or decelerate trends that were existing already. It's going to be very tempting, I think, to think that coronavirus created grocery delivery, but it was already happening and it just got ramped up as a result of the COVID crisis. So I think as you think about what's coming next, a great place to start is with what was already happening. And I'm going to touch on this at the end of the presentation as it relates to housing. And as much as we all want to know what's coming, it's important to remember that consumers do not know how they will change yet. I think you should be wary of any consumer surveys that are simply going to ask, how are you going to be, or what do you want after all of this? Because if you ask them, they're going to overstate the magnitude of how much COVID really impacts their behavior going forward. It's really hard for people to properly assess how much something they're currently experiencing is going to affect them down the line. And Michaela, my colleague who helped with this presentation, she had a great analogy, and she said, how many times has a pregnant woman going through labor declared, I'm never going to do this again? And yet there are a lot of women out there with 2, 3, or more children. So our sentiment in the moment is not always a perfect predictor of how things will be after this difficult time. So what we can do, though, is to understand the future trends, is to look at how some of the pre-existing trends from before COVID, to look at those, assess how the habits that were being formed during COVID are going to either accelerate or decelerate those trends, and then draw some conclusions about how we think that can create better homes and products that meet these new habits or fit these new habits. This is really important for housing. We've seen surveys that show that the great majority of people in the US expect there will be pandemics in the future. And really, who wants to go through this again in a house that they hate? They want to be somewhere where they don't mind being inside. So as I go through some of these trends that we see coming, I'm going to classify them as pump the brakes or hit the gas. And I want to really make a clear distinction here. Pump the brakes does not necessarily mean that this trend is reversing. We just think that it may mean that it's decelerating, or it's on pause, or something that really shouldn't be emphasized as much now. And I want to make sure that's really clear as I discuss that. Pump the brakes does not mean a reversing trend. So one of the first things I see is we do expect that there's going to be a bit of a pump the brakes on sustainability as a selling point. And when I say sustainability, I'm talking more sort of about the products that we've gotten used to. You know, consumers had kind of gone to this, they had reverted away from single-use products, but now we see them going back to that, these products that were previously banned or shunned. And they're going back largely because of safety concerns coming from reuse. There's also a large number of brands out there that are putting their big sustainability pushes on hold. So you look at GM with their car sharing program. Unilever suspended a number of its change initiatives. Starbucks has paused the practice of filling reusable cups. And BlackRock is one of the world's largest asset manager, actually reversed their recent commitment to put sustainability at the heart of their investment approach. And many local governments are even temporarily waiving their plastic bag bans. So with all these companies giving themselves license to put sustainability on hold, we think that many consumers are probably going to do the same as well. The question is not whether sustainability will come back. We think it will come back, it has to, but it's whether the money and the appetite are going to be as strong for that right now. So what can you do about that? Again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't offer sustainable products or build sustainable homes. Companies have to think about the kind of planet that people are going to want to live in. Sustainability is really less of a selling point, I think, in the near term than it perhaps it has been. So companies really should be thinking about where their advertising could be spent better. And if you are going to do it, focus on the cost savings around it. I'm going to give you an example of an advertisement or an infographic that KB Home has put together. It's interactive, and it shows you where the cost savings of these sustainable products are available over time. Where do we think that we were going to hit the gas? And that's on health as a selling point. This pandemic has really brought about an awareness of cleanliness. We're researching what cleaning products really work and how long the virus can live on surfaces. This new knowledge won't really disappear once the crisis is over, which is why companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble anticipate that a prolonged interest in cleaning goods will occur because people just won't forget what they've learned. Another reason that the virus does discriminate by health. So we are thrusting health into the spotlight right now. And the preoccupation with health in regards to the virus, it's going to trickle into our overall awareness of health in general. This is a huge advantage for new homes, which are always viewed as cleaner because no one has lived there before, and also because they can come with healthy home tech and cleaner materials. Healthy homes are still worth it and are worth advertising. And we think that builders are going to think more about designs that maximize health and cleanliness. And I'm thinking of like mudrooms specifically here. So here's a couple of examples of building products that are going to maximize this cleanliness mindset. Antibacterial materials, self-cleaning features, touchless devices, and even devices that can regulate your whole home ecosystem. One of the things that we think we're going to see a bit of a pumping the brakes on is the experience lifestyle. I mean, this shift, which was so heavily associated with the millennials in their younger years, was seen to be somewhat of a nomadic lifestyle or living downtown where all the action is. And so why do we expect a slowing of the experience lifestyle? Millennials really are forming families, meaning that home purchases and migration toward the suburbs was on their mind already. And this really may be a tipping point for them. Young adults are already becoming homebodies more anyways. Mintel did a survey that found that in 2019, even before the crisis had started, that 74% of millennials already prefer a relaxing night in to an exciting one out. And a lot of this comes from this wellness trend. Social media status is now decreasing, or increasingly coming from lifestyle posts about the home. So you talk about your home cooked meal, for example, rather than those experience posts about the bar you went to. We also think it matters for self-control as well, security and control as well. People who feel like they need to be more in control and secure, they feel that way if they own their own shelter. So what does that mean? We do see that there's probably going to be an increased value in ownership, and also an increased value in a term that we call suburban. It's really the idea of bringing the urban conveniences to traditionally suburban environments. So it's those things the conveniences you find in the city, but you can find them now in the suburbs, the small mini downtowns that you've seen a lot of suburbs investing in recent years. Suburban was just a term that we coined to really describe that melding of those two types of living together. Where do we think that we're going to hit the gas? And that's no big surprise there is the work from home. Work from home was already on the rise before the crisis. You saw mobile searches for for remote jobs increasing by over 210% over the last couple of years, according to Google. And again, this is even before COVID started. It also helps to really alleviate a major pain point. More than 2/5 of US workers see commuting as the worst part of their day. And so what does this matter for? We plan for all people, more people to be working, not all people, but more people will be working from home. About 16% say they expect to be working more from home. This also opens up the opportunity for them to live in more affordable areas. And we think builders should really think more about including 1 or 2 spaces to work from home in their home plans. Bonus points if you can think about lighting and noise reduction for these Zoom calls. So here's an example of some home offices. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but what you can see on the left-hand side is there's two working spaces that are defined there. And even if you don't have an office with 2 working spaces, you can make use of some existing space, like this little mudroom that had a little spot for a desk that allows more people to work from home. You've got more dual income couples working from home. And the last trend I want to talk about today is just pumping the brakes on these extreme open layouts. I mean, extreme open layouts are great until you actually need to live in that space with more than one other person. There's really not any place to hide your mess. The noise carries everywhere, and there's really no private space for separation. We found that consumers want an additional defined space in addition to that, or a semi-defined space in addition to that great room concept. So what does this mean? We're not saying that great rooms are going away. There's a great opportunity for them for a number of reasons, but we are going to see some more creative segmenting or separation of space. Here's an example of a partial wall on the picture on the left, and this bar that's actually on the right that's robotic, and it can move in and out, creating more of a closed-in kitchen area and creating an opportunity for open space in the back there. What should we be hitting the gas on right now? We think this is right-sized functional homes. The quarantine has taught so many people that a small house with no yard really doesn't work. People are realizing that when you actually spend time in your house, you start to realize all the things that function and things that don't. And so you really see the value in a house that works well for your lifestyle versus just looking good. There's also an economic impact that will have people searching for in a more efficient home, one that doesn't just cut costs by scrimping or on size or storage. And so what's going to grow out of that? We do think that more traditional apartment style multifamily is probably going to lose out to the single family rental homes, which are less dense and they come more often with a yard. You're going to see more outdoor space usage, which it's already huge, but it's going to become an even bigger selling point. And then this increased demand for homes of practical size with practical spaces. And what I mean by that is, it's a feature that you never knew you knew until now you can't live without it. This drop zone here in the back is great. It's built off a owner's entry near a laundry room. It's got a sink right there, so you can drop your things off and then wash your hands right away. So quickly, I'm going to go through a couple of conclusions that we came to from some financial conclusions. I think spending is down, partially because earnings are down, but also because people are being cautious. We've seen more people negatively impacted financially by COVID than those positively impacted. That's based on a survey that we had done. We find that retirees are the most steady. And we think that there is going to be this short-term reshuffling of housing followed by a prolonged period of thrift. In terms of strategy, and I think how consumers and businesses are going to be looking at this, from a marketing perspective, this is just sort of a recap of what I've talked about already. Less emphasis on sustainability as a selling point, more emphasis on healthy living. For sales, we think that we're going to see that quality of life conversation shift to controlling your own destiny with ownership, to flexible work hours at home and no wasted time commuting. And then for design, I think there's going to be more thoughtfulness about the open layout concept and more emphasis on a great home office with a connection to the outdoors. I know I'm getting close to the end here, but I want to come back to this slide here, which we talked about, looking at the pre-existing trends, assessing how COVID is going to accelerate or decelerate those, and then maybe draw some conclusions about how this impacts housing. And so I just want to share with you a few demographic and housing trends that we were seeing already prior to COVID that I think will probably be accelerated as a result of all this. This growth shift from cities to suburbs, it was already happening following a surge to the cities after the Great Recession. And as the millennials age, I think it's going to continue. And I think we might even see a share of the population, want to give up that higher density living for a bit more space. Retirees want to be closer to family. We're already seeing this as well. Retirees following their kids and their grandkids across the country. That's really the new amenity in retirement, is being near your family. And I think the separation that we're experiencing from families right now is going to spur on more of this activity. The migration to warm, affordable areas of the country, this has been going on for decades, but I think this might be more of a factor as customers get more cautious about their spending. Ultimately, they're going to follow where the jobs are. A slowing of immigration, we've seen this for the last several years. We've effectively shut off our borders for right now. So I think this is going to continue. And just to keep in mind, this is heavily dependent on government policy. We do see some first-time buyers really entering the market, and I think taking advantage of those low mortgage rates. I think this could be the buying opportunity of a lifetime for young adults who have the means to do so. I think we might see actually a small pop in the millennial homeownership rate this spring or summer as a result of these low mortgage rates. And then last up is the single-family rental homes. A third of renters across our country rent a detached home, or a single-family home, I should say, instead of apartment. And we've seen that share grow as that space has become more institutionalized in recent years. I think we've seen some people say that if they were ever to have to go through this again, they'd much rather be holed up in a house with more space than in a tiny apartment. So I think that's going to continue. And actually, we're doing a lot of work for builders and developers who are looking at building entire communities of single-family rental homes with, again, that sole intention of just renting them out. So again, these are some of these existing trends that were already going on that I think could be accelerated by some of the changes in consumer behavior as a result of COVID. And that just wraps it up for me. I know we're kind of tight on time, but Sarah, if there's any questions or anything you wanted to talk about, I'm glad to do so.
Sure.
Cut us off. He might cut us off. Okay. All right. Looks like I guess we don't have any time for questions today. But thanks for your insights on the consumers and the market. And we'll continue the conversation throughout the rest of the day on other ways in which we see COVID impacting housing moving forward. So thanks again for doing this today.
Thank you.
Yes, Chris, that really was excellent. I like the way you structured that. A lot of it's just interesting way to look at it. I mean, very clear. I think we all got a lot. I'm going to look at your slides again. I want to introduce the next panel, the moderator for the next panel. The topic is going to be impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. And our moderator, we're very fortunate to have, is Irina Esbenson, who's the chief economist for the California Department of Finance since April 2013. She directs the periodic economic revenue and population projections and reviews economic impact analyses of California's major regulations and provides advice on economic policy issues for the governor's administration. Prior to that, she was with the International Monetary Fund and also served as on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. So that's an impressive resume. Irina, are you ready to take over the panel? You can introduce the speakers.
Sure. Thanks so much, Devil, for having me. This is such a topical conference, and I'm really excited to hear what our panelists have to say. Samjita Mitra joined finance a few months ago, and every day I am thankful that she has decided to help out the state of California with her expertise. Also up, we're going to have Richard Green, who is a professor and specialist in real estate. Every policy topic in California seems to come back to housing, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And then finally, we're also going to hear from Steve Levy, who's been a longtime colleague and has really been following the California economy for decades now, and has great insight into both the Southern California and the Bay Area. So we're very fortunate to have his expertise on this. Just a couple of comments before I turn it over to Samjita. As Chris pointed out, everything seems to have changed with COVID. But on the other hand, it's really also exposed a lot of the structural issues that have been underlying California's economy and how we've been evolving as a state. Although everything is a little bit different right now, everything also looks very similar. So I'm going to turn it over to Samjita to go through some of those trends and to walk us through things that we are expecting in the upcoming near future. So Samjita, you have 12 minutes. I'll give you a warning at the 3-minute mark and the 1-minute mark. Take it away.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Irina. So Albert Einstein once said, "I never think about the future, it comes soon enough." With all due respect to Dr. Einstein, my colleagues and I in the Economic Research Unit spend a considerable amount of time thinking about the future, especially what it means for the California economy. especially now that we're looking at a whole new future than we envisioned just a few short months ago. But before I discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the California economy, let me set the stage of where we were at the beginning of 2020. So in January, things were looking good. In fact, things were looking great. Both the US and California were at historical low rates of unemployment at 3.6% and 3.9% respectively. We were in the longest economic expansion in history at just about 10 years of consecutive job growth. And in fact, 1 out of every 7 new jobs created in the country were created in California. We also saw real per capita income grow by about 23% from 2007 to 2018. All of this contributed to California becoming the 5th largest economy in the world in 2017, with a nominal GDP of $3.1 trillion in 2019, with a population just a shade under 40 million. This meant that our state was fiscally in a very strong position with a projected budget surplus of about $5.6 billion for the 2020-21 fiscal year. However, despite these strengths, as Irina and Chris mentioned, there were still some pretty significant structural challenges in our state, even before the COVID-19 economy. One of them, declining population growth and a critical housing shortage. Another significant challenge was the stagnating growth that we've seen amongst low-income households. We do have a progressive tax system in our state, and which means that about the top 5% of earners pay about 90% of the state's income taxes. And we're also seeing really no growth in median income. The real median household income only increased about $30 a year from 2007 to 2018. All of this really suggests that people were really not doing as well, and inequality continues to be a significant challenge for California, even before COVID-19. So this is a chart that shows the annual population growth in California from 1990 to 2060, about 70 years. From 1975, California's population almost doubled in size from 21 million to just under 40 million last year. However, at our current rate of population growth, it will take another 200 years for us to double again in population. Why? People are waiting longer and having fewer children. There are also some changing demographic patterns in education, marriage, and employment. We're also experiencing lower net migration and increased domestic out-migration to other states and decreases in net foreign in-migration. In 2019, 40,000 more people moved out of our state than moved in, for the first time since 2010. The Demographic Research Unit at the Department of Finance projects that our net population increase is going to fall to less than 100,000 annually by 2045 and close to net zero by 2060. So from just under 40 million, we expect to reach about 45 million in 2060. So we are going to face some long-term implications of our slowing and aging population in the next few decades. Meanwhile, we are also dealing with a chronic housing shortage that is exacerbating housing affordability for the average Californian. The share of household homeowners has decreased from about 58% in 2007 to 55% in 2018. 1 out of every 5 Californians pays more than 50% of their income in housing costs. The young, the old, and lower income households face the greatest rent burden. 1 in 4 are severely cost burdened in 2018 versus 1 in 5 in 2007. Part of this is due to the lack of housing that's available throughout the state, particularly in higher cost regions such as the Bay Area and in Southern California. And as this chart shows, as population growth diverges from housing growth, the number of individuals in a household necessarily increases over time, whether it's multi-generational housing or roommates and other groupings. In 2018, there was a gap of about 550,000 units between the actual growth in the adult population and the number of housing units. The lack of housing and housing that's affordable for the average Californian remains a challenge and a constraint on our economic recovery as we move forward in the post-COVID-19 world. So all of this was happening, and then COVID-19 hits. So in January, we had the first US case. March, it was declared a global pandemic. Also in March, California was the first state to really address the challenges and issue a stay-at-home order. Through June 15th, we've seen just about over 2.2 million cases in the US and about 150,000 cases in California. So while we had 10 years of economic growth and some ongoing challenges, we do see that the public health measures to slow the economy, slow the spread, and flatten the curve that includes our social distancing, wearing masks, and other measures had an immediate and ongoing impact on our heretofore thriving economy. The continuing pandemic, without any treatment, without adequate contact tracing or testing, or the potential of a vaccine, will continue to drag on the economy, even as California and the rest of the nation are in various stages of reopening and adjusting to this new normal. In fact, the National Bureau of Economic Research declared that in February, because of COVID-19, we actually entered a recession, which is the fastest of the NBER has ever declared a recession. So what does this mean for our employment? As this chart shows, California's unemployment is in tandem with the US, but generally slightly higher. So we went from 3.9% in February to 5.5% in March to 15.5% in April. May's unemployment numbers are going to be released tomorrow by EDD. The Department of Finance projects unemployment to reach 24.5% in the second quarter, meaning that about 4.8 Californians are going to be out of work. This is double the number of Californians who were unemployed during the height of the Great Recession. We expect that unemployment is going to slowly fall to about 10.6% in the fourth quarter of 2023 at the end of our forecast period, almost 3 times higher than where we were just a few short months ago. As people are laid off work, a significant number are also dropping out of the labor force. This chart shows the labor force of the working age population in California through April 2020. The dark color in the middle is the number of people unemployed in each age group. The lighter shade are those that are not in the labor force, and the darker shade are the employed numbers. You can see that the prime working age, those who are between the ages of 25 to 54, has remained relatively stable over the last 25 years. But the older cohort, those who are over the age of 55, has steadily increased as a share of the California population and as a share of the working population. We can see a boost in that age cohort who have dropped out of the labor force recently due to the impacts of COVID-19. This is a concern. If they've dropped out to collect Social Security, they will, before they were going to plan to retire, they're going to permanently receive a smaller amount of money over the course of their lifetime. Since February, almost 1 million Californians have dropped out of the labor force, likely due to COVID-19. If we were to include these Californians, as well as those who are misclassified as employed but not at work for other reasons, which is another 1 million Californians, and those who are working part-time but would rather be working full-time, then our official unemployment rate would likely be much higher. So in March and April, we saw a significant decrease and we lost jobs in every single employment sector. We lost about 2.6 million jobs in California just in those 2 months. Every single one of the 11 major industries lost jobs. In contrast, during the Great Recession, California lost 1.3 million jobs over a 3-year period. The job losses we see now are those felt in the lower wage sectors, with jobs that are less suited for telework and those who are affected by the stay-at-home and business closures. Leisure and hospitality alone lost about half of their jobs in those 2 months. Tomorrow we're going to see where the job losses occurred in May when the EDD releases their labor market data. So the previous slides showed the actual job losses. We project that the job losses in 2020 will mostly will mostly undo the decade of job growth we experienced after the post-Great Recession. And we'll see that the largest share of job losses are going to be the lower earning sectors in leisure and hospitality and retail trade. These are also the jobs that pay less than the average wage in California. The one industry that's going to continue to grow, and indeed continue to grow during the Great Recession as well, is health and educational services. And part of that is driven by the in-home healthcare workers that serve our growing and aging population. So after falling from 14.3%, we expect non-farm employment to grow in 2021 and accelerate to 3.2% in 2022. However, the 2023 job levels will still be lower than where we were in the pre-pandemic level of 2019. We project it's going to take about 6 years for us to recover our jobs post recovery in the COVID-19 recession, just 1 year faster than where we were during the Great Recession. So let's look at what the unprecedented job losses mean for our personal income growth in California. We assume that the minimum wage will continue to rise progressively for $15 a year. Despite wages falling in most sectors, the average wage is expected to rise, reflecting the fact that most of the job losses occurred in the lower wage sectors, and higher wage sectors were able to retain most of their staff. And as you can see here, the transfers have increased. The transfers from increased government payouts and the CARES Act, and that increased from 7.9% in 2019 to 17% in 2020, or $64 billion. We will not expect personal income to return to 2019 levels until 2023. So let's look at how this unprecedented COVID-19 recession has impacted our state revenues. We project total general revenues to fall from $139.4 billion in 2018-19 to $114 billion in 2021. By 2023, general revenue fund revenues will only have grown to about $128 billion. So in conclusion, here's what we've assumed for our forecast. We assume that our public health crisis will be relatively controlled, and economic activity in California is going to slowly resume as stay-at-home orders are modified and lifted. We expect that a recovery is going to be gradual and measured and restrained as businesses repair their business ties and consumers and businesses slowly regain their confidence to spend money. There's going to be ongoing risks of future outbreaks, especially if we don't have robust testing or contact tracing or vaccines. And businesses are going to have to make some fundamental changes in their operations, including temperature checks, the provision of PPE, automation, and maybe even shifting to online services. Some of these are going to likely shift, increase in permanent telework. That's going to impact both commercial real estate as well as residential location decisions. And as with any forecast, there are some ongoing risks that I wanted to highlight really quickly.
30 seconds.
Ongoing economic slowdown, the divergence between the state and federal policies, supply chain disruptions, and of course, climate and extreme weather events will likely affect California's economy moving forward. So as we navigate these uncharted waters, we're going to continue to incorporate new economic data and information so that we can continue to provide the most reliable information to Californians as we look to our economic recovery in the post-COVID-19 world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samjita. Great overview. Richard, would you like to take over and talk a little bit about the housing situation? You're on mute.
So I'm not going to talk that much about housing because I was asked to talk about real estate more broadly. But two quick comments related to the past two presentations. First, I found it a little depressing, the idea that health and sustainability are marketing points, when in fact, I see coronavirus as a short-run existential threat and climate change as a probably more medium run now than long run existential threat. And if this, because of our short attention spans, keeps us from paying attention to sustainability, that I find very worrisome and very depressing. On Samjita's excellent presentation, one thing I noted is she noted correctly, and from a positive standpoint, that California created about 1 in 7 jobs in the country, and it has about 1 in 8 people in the country, so that's really impressive. But we only built about 1 out of every 15 new houses in the country last year. So that suggests that we have a continuing problem. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides to move. So Samjita started hers by talking about Einstein. I'm going to start with Keynes. My favorite Keynes quote is, "When the facts change, I change my mind." And one of the things that's really important right now is we need to be learning constantly. And I've seen a view out there of frustration about, well, why can't these guys make up their minds? They say this is the right thing this day and that's the right thing that day. Well, COVID is a brand new virus, and we're figuring it out, and we're doing the best we can as we go along. And so part of learning is changing your mind when the facts change, and the facts now are considerably different than they were when we started this. And that wasn't because of bad faith or anything like that. We just know more as time goes along. The second, which is I think particularly relevant right now, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So I think one of the big issues we're confronting right now is there are businesses out there that are fundamentally strong business, but could run out of cash before they're allowed to resume their fundamental strengths. And finally, Robert Lucas, University of Chicago, libertarian economist, still admits we are all Keynesians and foxholes. And this, staying in the foxhole with Keynes is going to be very important to get us through this. I think it's important to start with some important news. There are things that are really changing. And the first of these, this is from a group called Civics, and this is net support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And as you can see that at the time of the Charlottesville rally, there were more people who did not support it than did support it. That has changed over the last 3 years to now it has 27% net favorable support. And the way I am optimistic about America, or the way I characterize America's greatness, is there have been moments in our history when we have confronted our deficiencies and gone to work on remedying them. And we still have a ways to go, but I think maybe we are at one of those moments right now. And in confronting these deficiencies and inequities, we may do some of the things necessary to change them. Among other things, I was encouraged today, the state Senate in California passed laws that would make it considerably easier to build housing in the state of California, particularly denser housing in places that are not accustomed to so much density. I think the transit-oriented community programs that the city of Los Angeles implemented in the aftermath of Proposition JJJ is sort of a small example of this sort of thing. We need to do more of that stuff, and maybe now we will. The second thing is a paper came out in Health Affairs just the other day, and this is one of the top medical journals, that shows that, you know what, masks really work. So Governor Newsom's requirement today that we all go wear masks when we are out in public or within 6 feet of other people or indoors, I think was one smart policy. But the impact of wearing masks, it's quite apparent, is enormous. And in terms of getting this thing under control before we have a vaccine or a treatment, this seems to be a really, really effective thing to do. And I commend the paper to you. It's very well done. It's still not the ideal controlled experiment that we would all like. We're doing, again, the best we can under the circumstances, but I find the evidence pretty convincing. And for whatever it's worth, if you look at my Twitter feed, I've had a mask on in my picture going back a couple of months. So I think this is just the responsible thing and the considerate thing to do, and could really matter to our ability to open up. Now, here's the problem. If we look at what's happening to curve flattening, if you go on the right, these are the big states. If you go on the left, these are sort of the next tier of states in terms of number of cases. If you look at the far right, the red graph, the red line is California. And while you could see, we are fortunate in that we don't have remotely as many cases as New York and New Jersey, despite the fact that we're a much bigger state. Our curve is not flattened yet. It's still, in fact, if you look carefully, a small exponential growth path for California. So wearing masks is really important. We really have, we have it sort of at a low level still, but to say it's under control, I think is not right. At the current rate of doubling, it would be very problematic if it continued for another month. So again, wear those masks. I worry about this. Okay, but to be fair, there's also this going on, which is, this is deaths per day, and clearly there's a secular decline downward, about a third the number of deaths now from COVID on a daily basis than there were a couple of months ago, or roughly a month ago. And even if you take New York and New Jersey out of it, which is what makes it look like New York and New Jersey are what's making the US look like it's flattening the curve, we still have a reduction in overall deaths, but still, we cannot be complacent about this. Okay, impact on GDP, the range of forecasts right now is the first quarter will be on an annualized basis, second quarter, 20 to 40% hit. This is roughly between $1 trillion and $2 trillion. The CARES and other acts are contributed about $3 trillion. Consensus multipliers, this will restore about $1.8 trillion in economic activity. And that, along with the Federal Reserve being very aggressive, I think has actually worked pretty well. And what's striking to me, I'm actually going to go ahead to a graph here. This is what's happened to business cash flows or business cash on hands in May. And as you can see, the share of businesses that had 1 or 2 months of business operations cash flow on hand jumped pretty substantially between April and May, from about 24% to 32%. And you're saying, how is that happening? Well, this is the Paycheck Protection Program Act, which infused about $830 billion into businesses in the US in exchange for them not laying people off. And so I worry right now, as people are saying, seeing retail sales coming back, looking better. And so they're thinking maybe we're going to see the V, but I think if this money goes away, and also generous unemployment benefits, if this money goes away on July 31st, which is when it's currently scheduled to go away, I'm not sure that this recovery continues. Secretary Mnuchin said last week that he didn't particularly want to see an extension of unemployment benefits, for example, beyond July 31st. I think that would be an enormous mistake. I think keeping cash in people's hands is critical in terms of keeping this recession from being a lot worse than it otherwise would be. So, I mean, we've already talked about unemployment, initial claims, just enormous. They've again come back down, but still at, normally in a normal month, we have initial claims of less than 200,000 a month. We just had the new number today come out, about 1.5 million. We're still seeing a lot of people leaving their jobs. But the other thing, again, what's key is keeping the plumbing going. So this is about solvency versus liquidity. So it's key to keep tenants in place. It's key to keep landlords so that they can pay their mortgages. Because if businesses disappear, it's hard to restart them. So think about tenants who have a good business. The value of the business is positive. Cash flow dries up for 3 months. The present value of the business falls, but it remains positive. And as you get closer to the point where you can really reopen, the value of that business returns to its former level, pretty much. So whether we have to stay inside for 2, 4, or 6 months will matter a lot. It seems like we're going outside no matter what the health consequences. But the other thing, keeping these businesses alive is critical to the US economy. And there are worries about the various programs on both the unemployment side and the business side, creating moral hazard by keeping people who have not run good businesses from getting flushed out of the economy anyway, by encouraging workers to stay home and not going to jobs which don't even exist. So I don't worry about that. So moral hazard to me is not an important concern. So I know my time is limited, so I do want to quickly cover real estate. Owner housing, the reason I'm not convinced we're going to see a big uptick in it is because one of the things that's happening as a result of this is people are taking hits on their credit, on their FICO scores. One thing I would love to see is credit scoring reform. I think that could be an important long-term outcome. The way we do it right now is both not particularly predictive of the ability to pay debts and I think inequitable. It prevents, in particular, people of color from getting access to the best quality credit. The point is, if fewer people have access to good credit, as we see lenders tightening up their lending standards, which we are also seeing, people having the opportunity to buy owner housing, I think, is going to be attenuated. Apartments, rent collections are down, but not by that much. The question is, again, if unemployment benefits disappear, what will happen to rent collections in the short run? They could fall considerably. But longer term, the rental housing market, I think, is in very good shape because, again, the demographics, I think, are there for it. I think there will be, as I said, fewer people able to go into owner housing. We continue to see millennials, while they are getting married because they are just getting old, their still rate of marriage relative to previous generations is much lower. And so I still think the news for apartments is good, and we still don't have remotely enough of them. And more broadly for the housing market, since housing supply is not where it needs to be, it's hard to see it taking a great hit. The industrial market is doing fine now, and we'll probably see an increase in demand at the end of the crisis. What we're seeing is people getting even more accustomed to e-commerce. Once they start liking it, more people liking it, they will continue to like it. There are bricks and mortar retailers like Target that have done a brilliant job of combining e-commerce with bricks and mortar commerce. I expect them to do exceptionally well. But if you look at a company even like Target or a company like Costco, the industrial part of their supply chain becomes increasingly important. The office market, this is the one that's really tough to call because you have these two countervailing factors at play. Is on the one hand, people are going to need socially distance, and talking to office owners, what architects are telling them is they're going to need to have about twice as much space per worker as they use now for workers who are actually in place. But on the other hand, and this is to Chris's point, I'm going to say it's going to be a little more than 16% who sometimes work away from home for the following reason. Managers have gotten used to the idea of people working at home and see that it can be okay. I can tell you at USC, we had these big fights over whether staff had to come in every day before COVID. And in a world like Los Angeles with bad commuting, I thought it absurd that all of our people needed to come into work every day, all of our staff. Now we see that our people work very well from home, are very productive from home. At the same time, people are going to miss each other. They're going to want to go to the office sometimes. So the idea that we're going to have people working 100% at home, I think that's going to be a very small share of workers. It could be call center workers do that because we actually see call center workers are more productive at home than they are in the office, and you don't have the knowledge spillovers. Yes, Irina?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. Retail is just bad. There were comorbidities before. It was stuff beyond e-commerce, among other things. Income inequality is bad for retail. There's hollowing out of the middle class is why places like Penny's and Macy's failed. Coronavirus just sort of stomped on it earlier. And finally, hotels, it's just hard to see any good outlook there for at least 3 or 4 years because that's probably how long travel behavior will be influenced.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. You also had a question about, from the audience, about the impacts on different groups, and I think we're going to come back to that after we...
Well, let's give Steve his time, and then we can do the conversation.
Steve? You ready to get teed up?
Hi, I think that the staff is going to run the slides. So every 4 years, SCAG develops a regional growth strategy that looks at land use, transportation, sustainability, and increasingly broadening economic opportunity. I was asked not to think about the short term, but to ponder on the questions of whether and how COVID might affect the region's growth in, say, the 2025 to 2045 period. Next. Move the slide, yeah. So I agree with Samjita that COVID has created enormous economic pain, and I would add human pain within the region and the state. And I would agree with Richard that likely we're going to need to continue some variety of the support payments that the country has made to businesses and to people. But I would add a third point before I get to the long term, which I would encourage COME to get together with the other executive directors of the big regional agencies and join with the people in California that are calling for a large infrastructure stimulus recovery bond. We can't do it through the budget, but we can borrow and spend to go beyond just recovery to stimulus. Let's look on the next slide at what that could do. You could make a COVID recovery effort support our regional growth strategy here, the regional growth strategy where I live up in the Bay Area and throughout the state. A recovery bond could pour billions into low-income housing, which, as everybody has said, is a great need, but the overcrowding and the homelessness is also a breeding ground for COVID. We could support the large existing backlog of transportation investments laid out on the SCAG plan. And to Richard's point, we could not lose sight of sustainability and accelerate energy investments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we can stimulate job growth in response to the COVID challenge. At the same time, we're building for the long term. So next slide. If you think about the long term, and I know this is a bit wonky, our growth here depends on how fast and how the national economy is going to grow and what share we're going to get of that. And my question was, has COVID changed any of these long-term growth trends? Next. I was here in 1990, and I want to restate a couple of Chris's points. When we were doing the long-term growth forecast in 1990, the biggest mistake we could have made was to assume that the huge loss in aerospace and defense jobs that caused us to grow so much more slowly than the nation and was dominant in the SCAG region would continue. So Chris's 2 points that stuck with me are, you don't make decisions at the bottom of the pandemic hit because you're going to be clouded by pessimism. And 2, we don't actually know what's going to happen in the long term. To tease a little bit, when birth rates were rising, DOF projected a population for the state that seemed sensible to them and perhaps to me that turned out to be 10 million too high. I'm not sure we're not making the same mistake again by assuming that birth rates will continue to plummet and that everybody's going to leave the state. Next slide. Next. Okay. You can see that the SCAG region took a big hit in terms of our growth relative to the nation after 1990 for a few years. But you can also see that in 2019, despite losing our largest economic base sector, which never returned to its former size, and despite the 2008 to 2010 recession, last year we had the highest share of national growth. That is, we did better relative to the nation. Samjita pointed that out, than at any time since 1993. And so this region and this state has been able to shake off previous hits to our economy. And while this one is very deep, the question we have to ponder is, has it hit our structure, our economic base structure, like it did when we lost the aerospace industry? Next slide. So there are 2 things that SCAG staff need to be looking at as we go forward. One is what's going to happen in the nation. This graph is actually wrong, my mistake. When the Census Bureau looked at immigration continuing at half the current level, it would reduce the long-term population by only about 4%, not 6 or 7%. And given the very strong pro-immigration sentiment by business and by most people, not the president, it's very unlikely that this would continue for 45 years. Sorry, 25 years. The second thing, go on to the next slide, is what are the job trends likely to be? And the question for SCAG is not, is everything going to be terrible for the next 25 years, but is there anything that we know now or that we should be looking at to say that there's going to be a change in our relative growth, a relative growth that outpaced the nation in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. Is there anything in COVID first or otherwise that's going to change our long-term strength? Next. So, is the Pacific Rim suddenly not going to become the fastest growing sector compared to, say, Europe? Doubtful. Will the region not be an international and national tourism center in the decades ahead? We know that tourism is taking a hit now, but we're not expecting no one to travel between now and 2045. We're not expecting air travel to go down. We're expecting our amusement parks and our hospitality sector to remain well. We have a huge advantage in specialized design firms, whether they're auto design or architectural design or design of furniture. Why would that leave here? We're building a tech base in parts of Western Los Angeles and Orange County. Those sectors performed well. They're what pushed up our growth rate. And you'd have to present to me, and I take it as an open question, that COVID will change that in the 2025-2045 period. Skipping to the end in case we run into a time slot, a lot of this region's competitive situation will depend on housing. Next.
3 minutes, Steve.
Okay. Here are a couple of things that I think will continue. The international trade plus the move to online shipping plus our location as a distribution point for the nation, none of which are probably going to change, has led to a huge increase in logistic jobs in the Inland Empire. Next. Our airports pretty much have all expanded and are expanding and are adjusting to new customer demand. And until COVID hit, we were in a long-term record growth every year in air travel to the region. A lot depends for the region to be in trouble, say past 2025, you would have to assume that COVID remains. I don't know that. I don't know that anybody knows that. What I'm talking about assumes that whether it's 1 year or 2 years or 3.5 years, eventually COVID will pass. And we have to look at the long-term strength of the region next. Samjita said it well. Richard talked about it. What will we do on housing? The pessimistic forecast assume that the regional growth strategies, our regional plan is called Connect SoCal, and the state's initiatives, both the laws passed by the state, the current regional housing needs determination for all of our region, the success that LA County, LA City has made in, for example, ADUs, that none of that would succeed. Because if we can increase our housing production and through design and through funding increases, which are part of the SoCal regional plan, then we'll be able to reverse this strong out-migration, which I think everyone would agree is largely determined by the fact that it costs a whole lot to live here. If we cannot
30 seconds, please.
address those challenges, then the outlook for the region will be less than if we do. As I said before, a COVID recovery bond, including funding for more affordable housing, including acceleration of SCAG's plans to have housing closer to jobs, to reduce the commute, to reduce the cost of commuting and traveling, will all accentuate our ability to be relatively competitive in the long term. Last slide. Next. Next. I said it at the beginning. The short-term impacts are terrible. But prior to that, in a good economy, we strongly outperformed the nation. If we have stimulus efforts that support our long-term competitiveness, and if even a modest fraction of SCAG regions planned in transportation investments, planned land use and housing policies come to fruition, will increase our housing production and our housing affordability by at least 50% and strengthen our ability to compete for jobs relative to other points of the nation. Will never be as cheap as some of the other regions in the nation, but as the last decade has shown us, we don't have to be as cheap, but we can't continue to be much more costly than we are now. So the focus should be looking on reducing our cost disadvantage on housing, which is something we control, and on taking a look at whether there's anything in COVID that will really change the structure of where industry growth is in the United States, away from those sectors that have underpinned our strength in the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. You know, a common theme that I'm really hearing from all of the panelists is that even though COVID was completely unexpected, and even though it was so large and, you know, really took a lot of us by surprise, a lot of the problems that it exposed were pretty familiar. We already sort of know the policies that we would probably need to undertake to address them. The question really is, does COVID-19 and does the current Black Lives Matter moment mean that we can now actually undertake some of those different policies that have been stuck for a while? Richard, I'm going to let you address that first, and then maybe we could have Samjita and Steve also address the same question.
Sure. Well, and Steve, thanks for that presentation. One of the things about the immigration stuff, migration, that gets hidden in the overall number is if you look at the composition of in-migration and out-migration in California, we actually have in-migration among people with college degrees and in-migration among people who are well compensated. Actually, Dal had a student, Hyo-Jung Lee, who was also a student of mine, but Dal was his principal advisor. He did a great paper 4 or 5 years ago on educational attainment and migration. And so to Steve's point about the attractiveness of California, despite the fact that it's too expensive, despite the fact that the taxes are high, very progressive, despite the fact that the traffic is miserable, despite, people who can afford to come here are still coming here. The problem is we're seeing people get pushed out because they just can't afford to be here anymore. And you see a very different migration from 2008, 2009. So in 2008, 2009, you saw lots of migration to Texas from California. And the reason was that the difference in unemployment between Texas and California was very large. There were jobs in Texas, there weren't jobs here. And so people moved, and they moved, a fairly broad group of people moved. Now it's not about jobs. As Samjita pointed out, we have record levels of unemployment. The problem is you just can't afford to live here. And so what we're seeing, when we're seeing outmigration, it's principally to Phoenix and Las Vegas, which I take as, okay, here's a way you can stay kind of close to your family. If you're from California, you can drive to see your family, but you know, I can take a 20% pay cut in Phoenix and still afford a house that I couldn't even remotely think of affording in Southern California. So yeah, the fundamental attractiveness of California is clearly still there, but confronting these inequities, I think that requires us to first and foremost confront zoning. And ironically, of all cities, Minneapolis, which has now had its own set of problems exposed in the last 3 or 4 weeks, was a major city that basically did away with single family zoning. They did that about 6 months ago. And I think we need to think about doing making really big changes like that in order to hope to, if not solve, I mean, the other problem is very attractive places are always expensive. I think Steve referred to this. LA will always be more expensive than Fargo. I'm trying to pick on a place that's not going to offend too many people. But it doesn't have to be as expensive as it is. And so, so that's key. And then quickly on the point about credit that I saw, who was it? Oh, Ray Kalman asked. Hi, Ray. Yeah, I mean, clearly, this is how people of color have gotten screwed over and over and over. I mean, there are so many ways they've gotten screwed over and over again, but one of them is access to credit at a time when it's the best opportunity to buy a house. So you now have an environment where 30-year fixed rate mortgages can be had at 3%, but if you're a person of color, you ain't getting one right now. And so this is a place where the way we do the finance system absolutely exacerbates these inequities. And by the way, I am not advocating subprime mortgages. What I'm saying is there are lots of people of color who are really good credit risks, and this is something I've studied at some length, who are not getting access to the best quality credit because we basically measure people using standards that were developed still 40 years ago.
Thanks so much. Great points. Samjita, did you have any comments?
Unmute, please.
So I think I agree a lot with what Richard was saying. So we know that, you know, California is this really expensive place to live, but there are some benefits, especially in terms of, you know, talking to your colleagues, being in the same place and just kind of, you know, talking about ideas and stuff. So if we are going to see some kind of mass exodus from, let's say, the Bay Area or Southern California, I'm not sure that's really going to pan out. For now, it seems like a lot of people are working remotely, but it's a pretty short-term situation. I think we're still expecting at least a significant portion of people to eventually go back to work, however that looks, whether it's part-time, you're in the office a couple of days a week, whether we have to change how our office space structure is in terms of open spaces, that's going to change. But I really think people are still going to benefit from the innovation that happens, the entrepreneurship that happens from being in the same kind of environment. I think we can't really understate that and how important that's going to be for California's economy moving forward. So in terms of trying to improve access to equity, access to capital, access to home affordability, especially for underrepresented and disadvantaged communities, I think this is kind of a reset for us. You know, the COVID-19 is like this big pause. We had a stay-at-home order. We kind of have this opportunity now, if we want to build a California of the future, if we want to build a California that's inclusive of all Californians, what are some of the things that we can do to really make it accessible for the people that want to live here? So, yeah.
Final thoughts on whether this is an opportunity for California to sort of, you know, fix some of our structural problems. Steve, you have 1 minute.
The answer to your question is yes. The good news is that virtually everything that we've mentioned as a challenge is within our power to solve. It's within the governor's agenda. It's within SCAG's regional plan. If we build the housing, if we fund the transportation environment investments. Remember that if you're talking about equity, or you're talking about a place that welcomes all kinds of people, I think you'll vote California, not Arizona or Texas or Florida, which, by the way, now are leading the nation in showing that sloppy reopening is not the place that you want to be. But the main point is we can do this. California has always been a can-do and welcoming place. To your direct question, Irina, yes, COVID accelerates our focus on that. And yes, Black Lives Matter accelerates our focus, which we really have as Californians, on equality, even though there are a lot, as Richard said, of sloppy things in the way our institutions are formed. Our heart is in the right place, which you can't say for all other places.
Is a great and hopeful way to end. There was one other question about whether there is a job skills imbalance, and we're also working on that. So thank you so much for a great presentation. Dowell, back to you.
Irina, that was fantastic. Great question you threw out to the panel. What a great panel. Thank you very much, everybody. You were terrific. That was, we went overtime, but it was really worth it. My appreciation to you all. We have a couple more things to do here today. First is I want to really, thank everybody who was involved here in producing this this event. We're not done yet. We have the breakout sessions to come, and I'll describe those in just a second. But I want to acknowledge some of the key people who put together. Well, that's some of the key people. Huh? It took an army to do all this. Most of it was SCAG staff, but we also had our contributors from USC, and then we had all the moderators, the panelists. It was just a lot of, obviously I can't name them all, but I'm going to call out Kevin Kane and John Cho at SCAG, who are my key co-conspirators in working on the program together. And really the AV staff they have behind the scenes were marvelous today too. So thank you to everybody, and I think I deserve a round of applause to the whole crew here, if I can just offer that. And we're going to finish up now with our breakout roundtables. These are three excellent roundtables, I got to say. Starting at 3:45 is our timing. The first one is about education planning, LA Unified, led by Mary Pritchard. And she is a demographic research and planning analyst, has been involved with our workshop for a long number of years. And I know her panels are always well attended, because the show must go on is really a daunting task. I know that at USC, and we have higher ed, but I tell you, the parents of LA insist the show must go on at LA Unified this fall, because the parents are going crazy with the kids at home. So I don't know how you plan that, Mary, but you can surely share your secrets with everybody at your roundtable. The second one here is by Tom Vo, who's a senior regional planner at SCAG. And Tom is going to talk about how they're using technology to quantify the impacts and to track it. And that's going to be very interesting and very timely, of course, also. And then the third one is Larry Cosmont and Joseph Dieguez, who are both with Cosmont companies. Larry's the CEO and probably the best known person in Southern California with economic development and public-private transactions. So their post-COVID-19 toolkit, I mean, it's really something to have that. We had John Burns represented by Chris Porter in the keynote, and then we have this. We're really covering the bases here. And this part two of the annual demographic workshop. I think it's really a superlative lineup, and I'm going to try to duck into every one of these roundtables. So, and how do we get to them? The links are different. So here they are on the chat. Kevin, is this where they are? Yep. Yeah, Kevin's pasted in the roundtable links on the chat. We'll leave this up a little bit so you can find the links to where you want to go to, and each person can take their choice. It's a smorgasbord where everything tastes better because you can't decide what you're going to leave out if you go to one or the other. any one of these would be great. So I encourage you all to drop in. Typically, about 3/4 of our attendees end up going to a roundtable also. There's more Q&A in there too, a lot more Q&A, about a half-hour presentation and half-hour Q&A. So you can really learn a lot in there. Well, what a day. Irina, thank you for moderating that panel so well. And thank you to Samjita and Steve and Richard, my colleague from USC. Thank you. You make USC look good, Richard. Thank you. We need that always.
Well, better than the alternative, right? There goes my cat behind me. So that's what really makes people happy. So.
And you know, some of his expertise about knowledge about COVID comes from his wife, also the doctor. So he's got two brains in the house, you know, not just one. But really,
if you're including her, it's more like 2.2 brains, but.
That's two. We'll call our meeting to a close here, take a break, and then we'll come back to the roundtables. So thank you, everyone. It's been an excellent conference. I appreciate it.